So we'll go on to the next speaker, which was Colin Jacobs, who came back to astronomy from software development and politics. Interestingly, he's at Swinburne University of Technology. And he's going to talk about probing neural networks for science. What is it they are learning, which is a question a lot of us have, translating the patterns that you recognize into real science. So take it away, Colin.
Hi, thank you. So yes, I'm Colin. I'm a postdoc at Swinburne in Melbourne. Good evening, fellow Aussies. And I'm going to talk about a case study where we used deep neural networks to solve an astronomical problem, and a simple technique that helped us better understand what was going on inside and identify some potential weaknesses. So hardly a day goes by without new papers showing up on AstroPH using artificial neural networks or deep neural networks, and there's a good reason for that. We astronomers have lots of data and they work great. They're almost miraculous at finding interesting patterns in the data. But the more complex the problem is, the harder it is to cover all of the bases in the training set, and therefore to predict the biases and failure modes in your model. Like this example, here's a neural network that's great at telling the difference between a picture of a monkey or a guitar. But when you put the guitar near a tree, it thinks it's a bird. And when you put a guitar near a monkey, it thinks it's a person. Very hard to predict those sorts of failures in advance. And this has real world consequences. A deep neural network mistook an overturned truck for a distant billboard, and that led to a horrific accident. Also, maybe it's not life or death in astronomy, but still very important for us. So why is it difficult if you're using neural networks to look inside and figure out what's going on? Well, the models are so large and so nonlinear that any individual part of the input or any individual parameter is likely to have a tiny impact on the outcome. And so it can be, when you've got these days up to billions of trainable parameters, it can be very hard to examine a few and get a good understanding and generalize what's going on and make predictions from that. And if we want to better understand our models, we need something that's both explainable and interpretable. So a tensor of the trainable parameters at one layer in your network would be explainable because it has explainability, because it contains all the information to know what the neural network will do, but it's useless to a human being. You can't look at this and gain any understanding. Something like a plot or a 2D image is interpretable to a human being, but it has to have something that sheds real insight into what's going on in the network. And finding a balance between these two things tends to be quite challenging. So looking at computer vision models, for example, the first attempt to figure out what's going on inside is just direct inspection. So you have a look at the first layer of the network and see what the convolutional kernels are, these things that it's learned to convolve with the input image to detect features. And you learn that it's got an edge detector or something like that. Tells you how CNNs work, but not really how your model works itself. You can look at the feature maps. So on the right is what you get when you convolve a particular input with a particular convolutional kernel. And again, we see that it is detecting edges, it's detecting patches of color, but you can't draw too many conclusions. It doesn't help you mitigate this, this combinatoric problem where new combinations of inputs could lead to failures. There's another class of methods to probe neural networks called saliency maps. And broadly, they work by tracing a path back through the network so you can identify parts of the image that are most relevant, so most salient, to making a particular decision. So I took a picture of a gorilla and fed it through some of these saliency mapping algorithms. And you can see that in this example, the gorilla's nose and eyes are important in determining the correct class that is good at gels with our intuition. But is this useful to us as an astronomer, for instance? So my work has involved using deep neural networks to find strong gravitational lenses in the dark energy survey. So here are some examples of lenses that we found. It worked, which is great. A few hundred lenses from hundreds of millions of sources, but it did produce many false positives. Here's what a couple of them look like. Like on the left column there's some blue near red objects that aren't lenses. That's understandable. The next column, some false arcs like tidal tails or spiral arms. Again, you can guess what the network is seeing. Some may be lenses, but the signal to noise is too low. But most of the false positives are like the ones on the right. It's just not at all obvious why the network scored that highly as a lens. So it's the galactic equivalent of a monkey with a guitar. So looking at the feature maps of the lens finder, you can see that it's activating on the areas of flux in the image, but that's expected. It could hardly be otherwise. And here's a few more feature maps plucked out from inside the network, the left for lenses and the left for non-lenses. And the only takeaway from this is that maybe there's a pattern there, but explainability and interpretability are really both lacking here. You can't draw many more conclusions than that. Saliency maps may be a little better. Here's a GradCam, that's the algorithm, a saliency map applied to lenses. Okay, it's looking at the red parts are the most salient parts of the input, i.e. the source in the middle. That's expected. So for non-lenses, it's quite different. It's looking elsewhere in the frame when it's making its decision. That's interesting, but that insight only takes you so far. So to extend this, I've been doing something called sensitivity analysis, hoping to get some more usable insights. And this is where we want to ask, how sensitive is the network to some property? In other words, is its performance robust to changes in that property? So as an example, consider a network trained to recognize cats and dogs. We might ask, how sensitive is it to color, for instance? So we can reduce the color saturation in the image and then rescore those examples with the neural network and see whether the network's confidence has changed at all. Maybe the score would drop a little bit when you take color information out. So by systematically varying this property, we can visualize that relationship, and maybe if it makes sense to fit a curve or fit a line to that, and even quantify the effect. And you can do this not just with one example, but with a whole set of examples and do the statistics. So I made a software package that helps you do this analysis pretty quickly. You give it a trained model, a test set, and either a property that you want to test the sensitivity to, or some function that will transform the test set in some way. So it will do the analysis, make a plot, and quantify the effect for you. And so this is from the Journal of Open Source Software, and this is up on GitHub. So for the lens finder, I took two networks that were trained on different training sets and tested several different properties. Some are properties of some are astrophysical properties of the sources, and some of these functions that perturb the inputs. So for example, on the top here on the figure, there's a function that takes a radius and it occludes an annulus of pixels in the input image of that radius. So when you give that to Sensie, it will systematically vary this parameter, the radius, and see how those missing pixels affect the score. And there's some other examples there are convolving with a Gaussian kernel to simulate bad seeing and adding noise, for example. So here are some results. So what we're looking at in these plots is the mean score in the correct class. So if it's a lens, how highly scored it is as a lens. If it's not a lens, how highly scored it is as a non-lens. And the error bars are a standard deviation. So that tells us how much scatter there is in the neural network's predictions for that class. So here we look at the effect of removing color information by randomly scaling different bands in the image. So on the left, this is for lenses. You can see that the accuracy degrades quite quickly as color information is removed after the effect is, unless the effect is very small, then they basically just devolve to random guessing. For the non-lenses, it's a little bit different. So when the colors are mixed up, the networks appear, the performance certainly degrades, but they appear more likely to conclude the input is not a lens still. So that tells us that color is significant, important if we're going to look at single band images, for instance, and also tells us that it can lead to a bias against lenses when the colors aren't what it expects. Here's the example of that occlusion ring test. So on the right, when you occlude a ring of pixels around in an image that's not a lens, it doesn't make any difference to the score at all. But for the lenses, the performance does degrade, and it reaches a minimum about 1.3, 1.4 arc seconds, which is very typical for a strong gravitational lens that we might discover with this. So if nothing else, it confirms that the network needs some flux at these radii to be able to tell that something is a lens. It's not unexpected, but interesting to be able to quantify that effect. So this was perhaps the most interesting result. This is a test of the point spread function. So for this test, I made new simulations where the simulated PSF was better or worse than the PSF distribution used to train the networks. They were trained on simulations. So a couple of different test sets were used here to tease out the effect. But what we can see is that for one of the networks on the left, which as it happens was the better performing network overall, the performance has a maximum when the PSF mean of the test set is the same as the training set, but it's actually worse when the PSF is better. So this actually turns out to have practical consequences because we made an error when we built the training set. We used a PSF distribution that matched the DES science verification data, but that turned out to be a little bit worse than the PSF in the year 3 release data that we ultimately searched. So looking at this, it seems that we can conclude we probably missed some lenses that we might otherwise have found, because when the PSF is to the network unnaturally good, its confidence decreases. We also looked at, did quite a few tests on the magnitudes of the lenses and the lens sources, so the sources in the image. And here are just a couple of plots. What the left is the R band magnitude of the lens, the right is the G band magnitude of the source. And the takeaway is that, yes, you can see that the performance decreases as the objects get fainter. Of course, we knew that already. But this actually helps describe a bit of a selection function for the neural network lens finder. We can see that, after the lens R mag is worse than say 21, 21.5, that the accuracy drops a lot. And this is useful because it's very difficult to estimate the completeness of a search. But if we compare this to the theoretical predictions of what we expect to find in terms of distributions of magnitudes, then we can actually have a guess about how complete we're likely to be with a particular model. Finally, here's the results of a test for sensitivity to Einstein radius. So we can see here that the network seems to perform equally well across a whole range of likely discoveries. Sensie reports that a zero gradient is consistent with this data, so can be quite comfortable that, yes, the training set is robust. We've covered all of our bases in terms of the Einstein radius. So in conclusion, this technique is quite simple, but it gave some useful and quantitative insight into what these networks had learned about strong gravitational lensing. It showed that the Einstein radius was well covered, raised a bit of a red flag with the sensitivity to color. We don't want to be missing out lenses, for instance, that have unusual colors, like a red lens, something that would be great to find. And it helped us find this bug in the training set where the PSF simulations weren't as robust as they should be. So this will help the next generation of lens finders, but this technique is broadly applicable across all sorts of domains. It could work for regression problems, even for unlabeled data. So please, if this could be useful for you, check it out. Yes, I'd love to hear if you manage to get any insights using this technique. Thank you.
Thank you.